Right, so we're streaming. Okay, everyone, I'm just going to fix my view and I'll get ready to share my screen in 2 ticks. But welcome everyone to our, which a lot of people have called the museum very excited to have this review of some of the major literature that was released in 2020. I confess I have not read all the books on the list, even though we had a lockdown and I should have, but you know, we had no time in the museum for reading. So I'm excited to hear what Dr. Lasch Carroll has to say. As you probably know, Dr. Carroll is on our board at the museum, has been a member for years and instrumental in the programs that we do and the education kind of aspect. She teaches at the Albany College of Pharmacy. I left out a letter there, I'd say.
Health Sciences, it's a long one.
Yeah, and a letter, a word, and so she'll correct that. And then, as I say, we have our next event is Monday with Dr. Marian Keyes from Ireland. She's from University College Dublin, talking about women activists in America from Ireland. And then on Wednesday we have on the 31st, meet our genealogist, kind of an open house if anyone has any questions. So I'll turn it over. We're excited, as I say, to hear about these book reviews because some of them got a lot of attention, and you have a wide range too of books, Meg. I know they're not all, you know, kind of academic or serious writers, and that's the joy of the Irish writers. And as well, how appropriate that we're having this today. It's the anniversary of Synge's death. Poor man. Yeah, he was only 37 when he died. So we're, you know, it's nice to keep them alive in our thoughts. Absolutely. So I'll share my screen. And you just tell me when you want me to move them on.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. And I am going to do a review of 10 novels published in 2020. Actually, there are two. I've made 2 exceptions. 2 of the novels were published in 2018, but a paperback came out in 2020 for one, and a film version, a television adaptation for the other. So I kind of harnessed them into 2020 as well. And Elizabeth, if I tend to go over, Elizabeth is going to give me, you know, the time to end. So if I end abruptly, that's why. And I'm going to begin just by giving kind of just a, you know, an overview of some lists of books, more books that I'm going to talk about, and try to address very quickly the question of why are there so many Irish writers before I get into the 10 novels. So this topic really was born back in June 2020. And I remember I actually said to Elizabeth, boy, it seems like every other week there's a review in the New York Times Book Review for an Irish novel. And, you know, as I continued to watch this pattern, I thought, well, I'm going to make the COVID shutdown my time to read the as many 2020 novels as I can. And I already knew, I thought my first line is going to be 2020 was a banner year for Irish fiction. And as I started to look into some Irish publishing, I realized that actually every year for the last 100 years has been a banner year for Irish publishing. So I can't necessarily say 2020 has more than other years. And we've all heard that the Irish have produced more writers per capita than most other countries in the world. So I thought, if I can't make the claim that 2020 is a banner year for Irish fiction, I could talk about 2020 in terms of how prolific the Irish are. I found out, so I thought I'd try to get some numbers to substantiate that, you know, most writers per capita. And I actually found out that Iceland has the most writers per capita. 1 in 10 people in Iceland will publish a book. And I couldn't get a number for Ireland, except kind of a vague statement. Ireland's not too far behind Iceland. So before talking a bit about the novels, perhaps another question to consider is why are there so many Irish writers? There are dozens of writing awards each year in Ireland and the UK that Irish writers are eligible for, many with generous purses. So perhaps that encourages writers. And here, the next slide, please, Elizabeth. Here are a few of the awards, and there are many, many, many more, but here are just a few with some of the big purses. And so again, maybe this is what encourages Irish writers. The Dublin City Council's International Literary Award has a purse of €100,000. The Man Booker Prize has a purse of £50,000, and 7 Irish novels have won the award since its inception in 1969, and 36 Irish novels have been shortlisted. The Irish Arts Council names a laureate for Irish fiction with a purse of €50,000, The Donoghue Book Festival Award has a purse of €20,000 for the novel of the year and 10,000 purse for an emerging writer. And this one I had to put in for Elizabeth. The Kerry Group Novel of the Year has a purse of €15,000. So those are just some, and there are many more with purses like this. And the Irish government fully supports the arts with programs, grants, and initiatives. Next slide, please. But still, despite that, Donal Ryan and Liz Nugent, current writers, working writers today, said in a 2017 Irish Times article, it is nearly impossible for writers to support themselves on income from writing alone. Ryan said, I reckon I get about 40 cents per book, so I would need to sell a huge amount of books to make a good salary out of that. I can't complain. My publishers are fantastic. I've just signed a contract for 3 more books and my advances are really good, but still I have to look at the long term and the fact that I have 20 more years of mortgage. So you would need to sell a lot to earn a living from that alone. And then Liz Nugent, author of 2 award-winning #1 bestsellers, said, maybe now people will stop asking me why I'm driving a 13-year-old car. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's any easier necessarily to be a writer in Ireland somewhere else. Next slide. So why are there so many writers? James Joyce said, in spite of everything, Ireland remains the brain of the United Kingdom. The Irish, condemned to express themselves in a language not their own, have stamped on it the mark of their own genius and thus compete for glory with the civilized nations. And then many years later, in an article in the Washington Post in 1998, Colum McCann wrote, there is no industrial base here and hardly any capital and not many natural resources, but there is language, which like computer skills, we have come to possess and repossess deeply and sonorously. And then in 2017, Tom Kenny of Kenny's bookstore in Galway, many of you have probably been in Kenny's bookstore, he said, our parents brought us up to believe that Irish literature is as good as anywhere else in the world and that our writers are among the best ambassadors this country has ever had. In the same vein, others have written that the Irish propensity for stories, oral and written, reflects language as entertainment for a pre-industrial people and as power for a colonized people. So perhaps the Irish are just inherently better at writing. After all, 4 Irish writers have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Ireland ranking 8th in terms of how many Nobel Prize winners it has produced over the years. But when you consider the population of Ireland in comparison to the rest of the world, 4 is a very impressive number. Ireland is 124th most populated country in the world. So while 2020 was a banner year for Irish publishing, it was a banner year in a long line of banner years. And we can still review what this past year brought us. Here are the headlines that were catching my eye in the New York Times book review section. And Elizabeth has the first slide up there. This list doesn't include nonfiction. It doesn't include novels set in Ireland by non-Irish authors. It does not include poetry or biography. And all of those appeared too. This is a list of fiction, primarily novels, but some short stories. So beginning, and I think we begin here in February 2020, we see a new edition of William Trevor's stories and a review of Colum McCann's new novel, A Paragon. In March, there were reviews of 2 new novels by Anna Burns and Anne Enright. Next slide, please. In April, Sally Rooney's 2018 novel, Normal People, is revisited as the TV adaptation is launched. In June, there's a review of Shadowplay, Joseph O'Connor's new novel about Bram Stoker, and a review of Roddy Doyle's new novel, Love. In July, there are 4 reviews, a review of the paperback of Kevin Barry's somber 2019 novel, Night Boat to Tangier, and a Colum McCann short story. Next slide. There's also in that month, a review of Maggie O Farrell's new novel, Hamnet, her imagined life of Shakespeare's family in Stratford, and worth mentioning, one of the 10 books the New York Times recommends for the year 2020, the top 10 of all books written in English. And we also see here an overview of Tana French's corpus and as in anticipation of her upcoming 2020 release, The Searcher. In August, we find reviews of Emma Donoghue's Prescient Pull of the Stars and Lucy Foley's murder mystery, The Guest List. Next slide. In September, Colleen Hughes's The Wild Laughter considers, as the headline reads, the catastrophic effects of the Celtic tiger. In October, 2 reviews of Tana French's The Searcher and 2 reviews of John Banville's Snow. In November, Edna O'Brien's 2018, it's another 2018 publication, her novel Girl, but it came out in paperback in 2020. And then next slide. And then we finally see Darren Anderson's coming of age story, Amid the Troubles. And I just included 2 more for 2021. 2021's off to a good start with Kevin Barry and another Sally Rooney novel. Thank you, next slide. Okay, so here's another list, a list of new fiction in 2020. This one from Ireland. It's a combined list of hot press recommendations for 2020 and the Dublin Book Festival top 10 Irish book releases, and these are all fiction of 2020. The names in blue are the ones that also appeared in the New York Times. Next slide. And this final list, I think it will be a final list, is the Irish Times new authors in 2020 to watch out for. So I'll ask Elizabeth if you're interested in any of these lists. Elizabeth said she'd post them on our Facebook page. So while, like other years, 2020 is a good year for Irish publishing, and like other years, we see a healthy list of works by new Irish writers. What does strike me as noteworthy in 2020 are the number of new novels from writers who were the new ones to watch 10 years ago, and they've continued to write. It also includes in 2020 writers born in the and they're actually the ones to watch from 10 years ago are authors born in the 70s and 80s. And they are writers such as, and I think we go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so here, these are some writers who published in 2020. And as I say, what struck me is these were writers who we were told to watch 10 years ago. And these are writers such as Roddy Doyle, Maggie O Farrell, Tana French, Emer McBride, Donal Ryan, Helen Cullen, Colleen Hughes, Louise O'Neill, and Ruth Gilligan. Next slide, please. And we also see in 2020 the number of writers who are at the peak of their careers, who are studied in college literature classes, and who are themselves the judges of the awards they once sought. They're writers born in the 50s and 60s, such as Sebastian Barry, Roddy Doyle, Anne Enright, Marian Keyes, Conor O'Callaghan, Joseph O'Connor, Colum McCann, Liz Nugent, John Connolly, and Emma Donoghue. They all published in 2020. And finally, in a category we can only call that's okay.
I just want to go into the next one.
That's all right. And I have a lead in anyway. So, and finally, in a category we can only call the Grand Masters, writers born in the 1930s and 40s, writers who were ushered into modernity by W.B. Yeats, John Millington Synge, and here's his anniversary today, Sean O'Casey and James Joyce. These are the first generation born into a free Ireland and thus not afraid to look critically at their homeland. And this is a generation that included but has already lost John McGahern, William Trevor, John B. Keane, Frank McCourt, and I'll include here too Maeve Binchy for transforming popular Irish fiction into a global phenomenon. This is a generation that still has representatives alive and writing, such as Bernard McLafferty, Jennifer Johnston, Seamus Dean, Edna O'Brien, and John Banville. And those last two, Edna O'Brien and John Banville, too, are on the 2020 list of publications. Edna O'Brien, again, I guess I keep mentioning this, she actually published the novel Girl in 2018, but it came out in paperback and it was reviewed again in 2020. Next slide, please. So I didn't read even half of all of those, but these are the 10 I did read. I read 10 novels from 2020 from those just listed, and my comments from here on revolve around these 10. So here are the 10: Edna O'Brien's Girl, John Banville's Snow, Roddy Doyle's Love, Anne Enright's Actress, Colum McCann's A Paragon. There are a lot of one-word titles I was noticing as I was typing this. Marian Keyes' Grown Ups, Emma Donoghue's Pull of the Stars, Maggie O Farrell's Hamnet, Tana French's The Searcher, and Sally Rooney's Normal People. So those are the 10 I'll consider. They run the gamut of serious literature, global in scope to popular fiction, from murder mysteries to historical fiction, from experimental to traditional, from examining public lives to peering into private lives. They all tell us something about Ireland. Amid the variety, we find a focus on the lives of women, the parent-child bond, and a search for identity. Most of all, they are about the power and fragility of what Roddy Doyle called his latest novel, Love. I'll discuss the group at the peak of their careers first, writers born in the 50s and 60s who have established themselves in the Irish literary scene. Around their full-time jobs as writers, around their full-time jobs as writers, and aside from regularly appearing as award judges, they often give lectures, they teach college courses, and they write the occasional piece for the Irish Times, the Guardian, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and journals of that sort. They've had critical studies written about them. Some no longer live in Ireland. They're involved in nonprofit work, and they have honed their craft, nurtured their social consciences, and have developed into keen observers of the human condition. So in this group, we'll see Roddy Doyle's Love, Anne Enright's Actress, Emma Donoghue's Pull of the Stars, Colum McCann's Epiragon, and Marian Keyes' Grown-Ups. So next slide, please, to begin with Roddy Doyle. Roddy Doyle made a fast name for himself with the Commitments in 1987, which turned into a trilogy with The Snapper and The Van by 1991. Film versions of all three starring Colm Meaney as the father, Jimmy Rabbit Sr., followed quickly between 1991 and 1996. The Van was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 1991, and Doyle's next novel, Paddy Clark, Ha Ha Ha, won the Booker in 1993. Doyle has written 9 more novels, including a historical trilogy, and a 4th novel about the Rabbit family, 20 Years On, and a novel published in 2013 called The Gut. He has won several other awards and has written in many other genres. His 2020 novel is Love, a running dialogue between 2 friends, Davy and Joe, in their 50s on a Dublin pub crawl. The 2 men have been friends since adolescence, but only see each other once or twice a year for a pint or 2 or 10 when Davy is home from England to visit his father. The opening shocker for Davy is Joe's admission that the year before he ran into the woman both men fancied from afar in their 20s. And he, Joe, has left his wife and children and is now living with the woman and her son. Davy is aghast, and from the first pint thinks to himself that this is it. He's going home and probably won't contact Joe ever again. Well, he doesn't leave. The 2 continue to drink and wander from pub to pub. The narrative moves between Joe and Davy's conversation. Davy is incredulous at the turn of events and presses Joe for more details, more reasons, more whys. And then the narrative bounces to Davy's interior monologue. As the external dialogue develops into Joe's musings on his marriage and his new relationship, Davy's interior monologue winds its way back through his own marriage, memories of his and Joe's 20s, his childhood, the death of his mother, his stoic father, and we learn the reason he is home this time, his dying father. Both levels of the story, the interior and the exterior, lead to reconciliations, understanding, and our reflections on the complicated, multifaceted, different kinds of, as the title proclaims, love. And I have to say, I loved it. The next novel I'll talk about is Anne Enright's Actress. It's another reflection on love and another reflection on relationships between parents and children and men and women. Most obviously, and no less profound for being obvious, the novel is about fame. Narrated by Nora, a woman living in Bray, a writer married with grown children, the story is Nora's backward journey in search of her mother, Irish stage and movie legend, Catherine O'Dell. Catherine O'Dell is a kind of Maureen O'Hara, a red-headed, green-eyed ingenue, Erin's sweetheart of stage and screen, an Irish movie star in the early years of movie stars, who even as her career fades, remains Irish gold. The narrative is framed by the request of a graduate student to interview Nora, now that's the daughter, to interview Nora for a biography of Catherine. Nora sidesteps a response by deciding to write her own. She follows Catherine's life from her birth in England, where her parents, one Irish and one English, play stock characters in small provincial theaters and eventually moved to Ireland to do the same. The irony of Ireland's sweetheart having an English mother is not lost on Nora. Catherine, now this is the mother, grows up in the theater and starts playing extras as needed in her parents' plays until her natural effervescence catches the attention of a theater manager. A catch that brings her to America, where her hair is dyed bright red. An apostrophe is added to her name. As you can see on this slide, the original spelling was Odell. And as she's becoming famous in America as the Irish Colleen, her manager decides to capitalize the D and add the apostrophe. And she becomes a captive of her own stereotype. She's the country girl in the big city, tainted gradually, worn down by her own stage success and stage persona, a success that catapults her to Hollywood and filmed repeats of her staged stereotype. She then becomes a new captive of the popular medium film and its studios of the 40s and 50s. Catherine is a true ingenue when she arrived in America, and she becomes the artificial ingenue for the rest of her life, a life that creates an emptiness and an identity void that is only filled by playing a part. So where does that leave Nora? She's in her 30s. This is the daughter, remember. She's in her 30s when Catherine dies. And she has grown up sharing her single mother with the world. She never knew who her father was. There's an especially poignant scene where Nora remembers herself as a child, all dressed up for Christmas, sitting on a stool in the wings of a theater, watching her mother nervously pacing and kind of snapping at her, and then watching her mother walk onto the stage and come alive with warmth and sparkle for the audience. Nora has been searching for her mother all her life, and this search for her mother emerges as a search for herself. Enright intersperses memories of Catherine with memories of Nora's own childhood and coming of age on Dartmouth Square in Ranelagh, and that's a picture of Dartmouth Square in the Ranelagh neighborhood of Dublin. As she captures some of Catherine's Broadway and Hollywood of the 40s and 50s, Enright captures Nora's Dublin of the 60s and 70s, when sexual restrictions were loosening, university education was opening, and the North was on fire. In middle age, Catherine's surprising involvement in the Troubles is reminiscent of Jane Fonda and Vietnam. Nora's own journey is cast in the shadow of her famous mother, Ireland's own, but never Nora's own. The novel then is Nora's attempt to understand her mother, an understanding that can lead to a posthumous reconciliation and a reconciliation that allows Nora to find herself. Our next novel, we'll move on to Emma Donoghue's novel, Pull of the Stars. Pull of the Stars was written before COVID-19 shut down the world, and yet it emerges as a metaphor for our pandemic year because it is about the flu pandemic of 1918. And as a quick aside, I read that Emma Donoghue wrote this certainly before we had any worry of COVID, and actually she submitted her completed manuscript to her publisher like the first or second day of March 2020. So it was even before COVID was a worry when her publishers got this. So Farrell has written 13 novels, primarily for adults, but also a few for young children. She seems to go in part for historical narratives, not always, but in part. Some of her historical fiction includes the story of an 18th century Welsh servant who kills her employer. Another is a 19th century British divorce case she writes about. And as we see here, the early 20th century flu pandemic. She's won several awards. Her novel, and this you may be familiar with, Room, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2010, and Donoghue herself wrote the script for the film version of Room, which won an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay in 2015. In her 2020 novel, Pull of the Stars, Donoghue brings us into the life of a nurse midwife in a Dublin City hospital during the 1918 flu pandemic. The hospital is overcrowded and understaffed. The poor sanitary conditions in the hospital, the ignorance about disease, the city overwhelmed by fear and overpopulation are played out in a world of extreme class division and gender inequality. We find abject poverty, church oppression, silenced women, and a Dublin still reeling from World War I casualties. The not so distant memory of the 1916 Rising is also there. A sick drop in the street and are carted away. Into the setting, we meet Julia Power, a nurse midwife who has volunteered in the trenches, who cares for her shell-shocked brother, and who at age 30 is resigned to spinsterhood. I realize as I'm saying all this sounds like a dire novel, but I really do recommend it. Not only because we too are living through a pandemic, but because of the vivid characters Donoghue creates. Most of the action takes place in the quarantine delivery room, where pregnant women have been admitted who have been exposed to the flu and who have gone into labor. Our nurse Julia is smart, competent, and compassionate. We hear her story, and we hear the stories of the lives of the pregnant women who come into her room. We witness births, deaths, and we meet Bridie Sweeney, an orphan who has lived in one of the notorious convent laundries since she was small. Bridie is sent from the convent to help in the hospital to volunteer, and Julia happens to see her and snag her on her first day in the hospital. Amid the squalor, Bridie has a natural buoyancy and intelligence, and there's a sweet connection that develops between Julia and Bridie. We also meet the historical Dr. Kathleen Lynn of Easter 1916 fame. She's a doctor in the hospital, and she defies the upper-class male-dominated medical establishment by taking charge of this delivery room. Amid the despair of the novel, Donoghue shows us bold characters who break the bonds of their class and gender and do make a difference. Our next novel is, how am I doing on time?
You're good.
Our next novel is Colum McCann's Epeirogon, and it is extraordinary. A heroic accomplishment, brilliantly executed, profoundly conceived, and after the first several chapters move us beyond confusion, a powerful and compelling read. At its core, the story is about two fathers, one Palestinian, one Israeli, who both lose young daughters to sectarian violence and who become friends and work for peace. And this is based on a true story. Colum McCann met the two fathers, and he creates his own dialogue, and they approved it. And he, as I'll mention in a minute, brings in all sorts of other elements. McCann walks us through the family's lives before the girls' deaths, describes how they die, and shows us the grief following the deaths. He includes chapters on the biographies of the fathers. Israeli Rami did a stint in the Israeli army, and Palestinian Bassam was imprisoned for 7 years as a terrorist. McCann shows us how their friendship begins, their growing peace initiatives, the group they form called Combatants for Peace, and their eventual journeys together throughout the world to share the same stage and speak for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. McCann has chapters on the history, besides the stories, those very compelling stories of those two families. He also has other strands. He includes chapters on the history of Palestine, the history of the Holocaust. He goes further afield to describing ancient art, the ruins of ancient art in the Middle East, the topography, the geology, the climate of the Middle East. He spends time on weaponry, such as how a rubber bullet is constructed and what happens when it penetrates the human body. And wafting throughout the narrative are descriptions of migration patterns of birds. There are 1,001 chapters in Epeirogon. Some are 10 pages long, some one sentence, some one word. Chapter 500 is followed by chapter 101. And then the chapters after 101 begin to decrease from 500 back to 1. Both chapters numbered 500 on either side of that 1001 chapter are the longest personal accounts of the two fathers. The one begins with, "My name is Rami Elhanan, and I'm the father of Smidir," and that's the daughter who was killed. And then on the other side of the 1001, we hear, "My name is Bassam Araman, and I am the father of Abir," also the daughter who was killed. And incredibly poignant, the two longest chapters. The 1001 chapters is a reference to the Persian classics, 1001 Arabian Nights, the story of an Arabian prince who, scorned in love, takes a new wife each night and kills her the next day. 1001 Arabian Nights is also the story of Scheherazade, a new wife who on the first night of her marriage to the Arabian prince beguiles him with a story, ending the first night with a cliffhanger that compels the prince to want the rest of the story the next night, so he spares her life for one more night. She does this 1,001 nights, mesmerizing the prince with stories of love. By the 1,001st night, the prince has moved beyond anger at women and has fallen in love with Scheherazade. And Scheherazade, on her part, has saved her life through stories. And this is perhaps the moral of, and it makes me choke up thinking about this. This is perhaps the moral of McCann's story. With time and in listening to each other's stories, we can move past differences and become one. We can save lives. And that is the metaphor of the epeirogon. An epeirogon is a geometric shape with an infinite number of possible sides. The novel itself is a collage, a kaleidoscope, an epeirogon itself, with its 1,001 chapters that do not move in a straightforward temporal line, with several strands of stories that jump in seemingly in no particular order in the narrative. It's like all the story strands, he has 5 or 6 or 10 story strands, and he smashed them all on the floor, and he randomly scoops them all back together in no particular order to make the novel. Ultimately, though, the disparate story strands all become part of what from afar an epeirogon is, and that is a circle. So I cannot recommend this enough, but it's, you know, it's a challenge to read it because there's a lot of sorting out of the pieces, but it is incredibly moving and it's worth the time to put to it. So let's see, one more in this category. More than any other writer in this category, Marian Keyes' fiction has been categorized as popular and bestseller. Her website says her books have been translated into 36 different languages. An Irish Times article in July 2020 said she's sold over 40 million copies of her books. And a website called Celebrity Net Worth says her net worth is $20 million. So she's one writer who can support herself on her writing. She herself says her readability, and and this is a quote from her, but she puts readability in quotes, belies dark social problems like domestic abuse, alcoholism, and depression. In an article in The Guardian in February 2020, Suzanne Moore writes, Keyes, who has talked of her addiction and depression, is able to touch deep subjects with lightness and that quality dreaded by the literary world, readability. Grown Ups was published in 2020 and is her 17th novel. I had never read anything by Marian Keyes, and I have to say, Grown Ups was a complete surprise for me, and in a good way. The novel is compelling in the way a Maeve Binchy novel is compelling, with a plot that moves, characters we grow to like, dialogue that sometimes is a little cliched, but it catches the rhythm and slang of contemporary Dublin, and enough real places in Ireland to make us feel like we're there, because it's very much a cosmopolitan Dublin that she portrays, which sometimes can be, you know, any big city. But she gives us enough place names, and her characters, Elizabeth, you'll like this too, they go to a spa in Kerry, you know, they go to a festival in Kildare. So there are enough place names mentioned where we feel we're there. The story involves the close and conflicted family ties of 3 brothers, their wives, and children, their daily lives, their family dinners, their vacations, their arguments, their worries, and their aspirations. We are in 21st century Dublin with a lot of what of her characters calls first world problems. This is Dublin post-Tiger, but post enough for the financial rebound to be felt. The characters enjoy big homes, nice clothes, material comforts, and vacations in luxury Kerry spas and Italian villas that financial prosperity can buy. They all have state-of-the-art devices and a panoply of fine international foods to choose from at the grocery store. But as the novel develops, Keyes reveals that each character is dealing with insecurities, hurts, and disorders that are life-altering and some life-threatening, and she doesn't gloss over these issues. One character is bulimic, and the novel probes the very real addictive danger of bulimia left untreated. Another spends uncontrollably, another kind of addiction. And in a country that suffered horribly from hunger and poverty, memories of memories that weigh heavily in the Irish psyche still, a food disorder and uncontrollable spending are significant. Keyes also weaves current social and political Irish concerns into her plot, such as the current policy for asylum seekers in Ireland. So again, it's I still would recommend it. It's certainly a faster read than Colum McCann's book, but I would still recommend it. So now to actually the next category, we also find newer writers with new novels in 2020, writers born in the 70s and 80s, writers, as I said earlier, who have established themselves as talents to be reckoned with, but they're still kind of the younger generation. And I read Maggie O Farrell's Hamnet and Tana French's The Searcher. Both O'Farrell and French have several novels to their names, prize-winning novels lauded as both literary and worldwide bestsellers. Maggie O Farrell's from County Derry and currently lives in Edinburgh. She was listed among Waterstone's 25 authors for the future in 2007. And as I already mentioned, the New York Times listed Hamnet as one of the top 10 novels of 2020. Hamnet is O'Farrell's 8th novel. Last year, she won the very prestigious British Women's Prize for Fiction with its £30,000 purse for Hamnet. In the novel, and I have to say, this is one of my favorites too. In the novel, O'Farrell takes the known facts of the life of William Shakespeare and fills in the family biographical blanks by weaving a full family story of the Shakespeares of Stratford. Unlike other imagined stories of Shakespeare's life, however, O'Farrell sets her novel entirely or nearly entirely in Stratford and focuses more on the family William leaves than on William himself. The central tragedy of the novel is the death of 11-year-old Hamnet Shakespeare, and that is historical. So the death of 11-year-old Hamnet Shakespeare, and while the death of the little boy impacts the extended Shakespeare family, O'Farrell focuses primarily on his mother, called Agnes Hathaway Shakespeare, not Anne. O'Farrell said in an interview that there is historic evidence that Agnes was pronounced with a silent G, so it was honest. And the name Anne, which would have been pronounced probably on, so honest and on were interchangeable in Renaissance and 17th century England. So Farrell chooses to go with honest. I'll probably say Agnes though. So anyway, she focuses more on the mother's response to the death of the child than other family members, although all of them are part of this. The great playwright, William, enters and exits the story as if he is a minor actor in the family saga. And like most extras, William is never even called by name in the novel. He's my husband, he's the father, he was the tutor, but he's never called William. This is definitely Agnes's story, Agnes's grief, and O'Farrell's writing grips her readers with the unspeakable despair of a grieving mother. Hamnet's death does not take place until almost halfway through the novel. The narrative at first flips back and forth between Hamnet looking for his mother or any grown-up to care for his sick twin sister, and then alternates with a look at the past, recounting Agnes and William's meeting, courtship, marriage, and the births of their 3 children. Most biographies of William Shakespeare offer the facts that Anne Hathaway was 8 years older than 18-year-old Will when she became pregnant, and a hasty marriage was forced on poor William. Soon after, the bare facts tell us Will leaves Stratford, and except for leaving his wife his second best bed in his will, that's all we ever hear about Anne Hathaway. O'Farrell creates a love story. Her Agnes is a mystic, a healer, and her bond with William is one of great love that defies the conventions of Stratford. O'Farrell gives us the interior streams of consciousness of all the characters, not only Agnes, but all the characters, and knowing what will befall sweet Hamnet, his interior jumbled thoughts as he desperately searches for someone to care for his twin sister in that first half of the novel. And his mother at that time is off in the woods gathering medicinal herbs. Hamnet's thoughts are especially poignant. And by situating his death in the middle of the novel, O'Farrell invites us to mourn his death too. He is loving, kind, and a scamp of a boy who is deeply worried about his sister. Agnes returns in time to cure young Judith from the plague, but not in time to prevent Hamnet from catching the disease himself. What follows is how Agnes, her in-laws, her other children, her brother, and her oft missing husband cope with her unspeakable loss. The writing is absolutely beautiful. The other novel from the same generation is Tana French, and The Searchers is also her 8th novel. Her first novel, In the Woods, appeared in 2006, a murder mystery set in Dublin that achieved immediate success, winning 4 prestigious mystery novel awards in 2008 for Best First Novel. By about her 3rd novel, French's fiction was categorized as police procedurals with a recognizable pattern: Dublin murder detectives investigating a murder that is somehow connected to the past of one of the investigators. Despite the more popular fiction subgenre and the main character patterns, French's Murder Squad novels do not fall into formula and are excellent psychological studies of trauma and social studies of facets of modern Irish culture. French's novels truly achieved, I think, the level of literature. Her 7th novel in 2018 was called The Witch Elm, and that is not in the part of the group of the first 6. It's a standalone novel, but it's still a murder mystery. This one is told from the point of view of the victim. And then we get to this novel. Her 2020 novel is The Searcher, another standalone novel. In this one, French's protagonist, Cal Hooper, is a retired Chicago policeman. So he's American and he doesn't even have Irish ancestry. He's a retired Chicago policeman and newly transplanted in the west of Ireland. He left America for really peace and quiet and moves to a small plot of land in the west of Ireland. He is reluctantly roped into searching for a missing person by the missing person's 12-year-old sibling. The novel then moves like a police procedural fiction, a search for truth in an unknown landscape. And the cop, even a retired cop, is the central moral consciousness. Cal is in an unknown landscape. He is an outsider in rural Ireland where nothing is as it seems. And this is contemporary times. He's got a cell phone and everything. But nothing is as it seems. The crack in the pub has hidden meaning. His neighbors' surface banter and joking has ulterior motives. The family of the missing person is not who Cal thinks they are. There's a social hierarchy, an unspoken code of silence shrouded in chatter, a powerful band of enforcers moving beneath the local guards, and secrets of history only memory and longevity hold keys to. Cal is navigating in the dark while at first he thinks he sees clearly. With every step, he finds a piece of the puzzle of the missing person, but he realizes there are multiple conclusions and directions from every discovery. Cal is supported in his quest through his own past, especially his childhood, with his backwoods grandfather who taught him to fish and to hunt and to survive alone in nature. And he's also supported by another part of his past, by his experience as a policeman. He knows how to methodically collect evidence and knows where danger lurks. What hinders Cal's progress is not only an unknown terrain, but that very same past in Cal's case, his broken relationship with his wife and fractured relationship with his daughter, who was withdrawn from him since being assaulted when she was in college. Like all of French's novels, the psychological intensity of the story revolves around a doubling of past trauma and present trauma. And the resolution is dependent upon either rewriting the past in the future or reliving the past in the future. The searcher ultimately enacts a search for truth, and that search is the kingpin of all of French's novels. I see it's quarter of. I'm asking Elizabeth, what should I?
I think you're good. People are still watching.
Okay, it's good to say I have three more to go.
Yeah.
Okay, of the younger batch of emerging and emerged writers, those born in the 1990s and later, Sally Rooney's Normal People is the only novel that I read. Actually, Normal People was published, as I mentioned, in 2018, but the TV adaptation came out in 2020, and that has kept her prominently in the culture sections of newspapers in Ireland, in England, and Scotland, and in the United States. Normal People is Rooney's second novel. Her first came out in 2017, and her third is due out this year in 2021. The news platform Vox claims that 64,000 hard copies were sold in the US in the first 6 months following publication of Normal People, and it debuted as number 3 on the New York Times bestsellers list in 2019. The novel was longlisted for the Man Booker in 2018 and the UK's Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019. It won Best Novel at the 2018 Costa Book Awards and was ranked 25th on the Guardian's list of the 100 best books of the 21st century. And the Harvard Crimson listed it as one of the 10 best books of the 20-teens and wrote, "It's a beautiful train wreck. You can't look away." The television adaptation was nominated for an Emmy in 2020. And telling you all of this praise, I have to confess, I really did not like the book. I didn't love the book. It is a train wreck, and 2 young people, it is a train wreck. And just a quick, and I don't want to spoil the ending. I hope I'm not spoiling the ending if you plan on reading it. Well, actually, I am spoiling the ending if you plan on reading it. But let's see, 2 young people, one reclusive and the other popular, named Marian and Connell, both damaged by their childhoods, take refuge in each other in secondary school. She is neglected by her mother and abused by her brother. He is the son of a single mother and an unknown father, and is, we're told, dependent on his popularity. The 2 explore sex, they discuss books and other intellectual subjects. They're both very smart, we're told, and they keep their relationship a secret. Then they break up because he does not ask her to, and I can't remember what the equivalent is of the senior prom in Ireland.
The Debs.
The Debs, that's it. They break up because he does not ask her to the Debs. And then a few months later, we find them transplanted from Sligo, their Sligo hometown, to Trinity College in Dublin, where Marianne becomes popular and Connell is the fish out of water. They reunite and again explore sex, discuss books and other intellectual subjects. They're still very smart, and they still keep their relationship a secret. Misunderstandings again develop, and there's another breakup. And this pattern continues through the novel until at the very end, when Connell is offered a scholarship for graduate work at an American university, Marianne seems to have an epiphany on the second to last page that all will be well, and she wishes him well. And that's how the novel ends. I was not convinced by this. Rooney's writing is good, and I think her first novel actually, the New York Times felt was a better of the 2 books. She was kind of rushed in the publication of Normal People. But anyway, I just wasn't convinced by the characters. Her writing is good, her dialogue is real, the story concept is interesting, but her characters remain kind of caricatures, especially Marianne. She's clearly traumatized by the abuse of her home, but Rooney paints the repercussions in broad strokes that emerge kind of as cliches. Connell's a bit more sympathetic, but his supposed need for approval is announced to us. We really don't see it in him, but we're told that's how he feels by the author. We are to believe his insecurity comes from his working class background and the fact that he doesn't know his father. And his mother is a domestic, back to the working class background. His mother is a domestic for Marianne's family. But Connell doesn't seem to bear the scars of illegitimacy or of being from the wrong side of the tracks. His mother is loving and understanding, and Connell is kind, and he is liked by everyone because he is likable. So for me, the parts don't all add up to make a compelling story. And I have not seen the television series yet.
Oh, that's a nice one.
So 2 more to go. And I've saved the Grandmasters for last. And these are the 2 I did want to get to. So I would have skipped Normal People, actually, if you told me to. I've saved the Grandmasters for last. Edna O'Brien and John Banville, the greats who were born in the 1930s and 40s, who wrote alongside John McGahern, Brian Friel, Seamus Heaney. They too played their part in Irish fiction 2020. Edna O'Brien published Girl, and I mentioned that it's the paperback that came out in 2020, but the New York Times still reviewed it. Let's see. And let's see. And so Edna O'Brien published Girl. This is her latest novel, 2020 review of the paperback. She was born in 1930 in County Clare and has published 19 novels since 1960. Like many of the other writers I've talked about tonight, she's also written short stories, plays, and books of nonfiction, many genres. She's won literary awards in Ireland, the UK, Europe, and the US. Mining her own experiences, her writing probes the limitations women face in every facet of life. Her first novel, The Country Girls, spoke candidly about women's sexuality during a particularly repressive time in Ireland, the 1950s. The book was banned in Ireland until 1967. O'Brien wrote in her 2014 memoir called Country Girl that Archbishop McQuaid, the very powerful Archbishop of Dublin, and Charlie Haughey, who was Minister for Justice then, decided that, quote, the book was filth and should not be allowed inside any decent home, end quote. And in a 2005 article by Donal O'Driscoll, we read that The Country Girls, you know, the novel The Country Girls, it also is a name for a trilogy, the first three, but the first novel itself is called Country Girls, that The Country Girls actually, and its two sequels, were publicly burned in Ireland, including Edna O'Brien's own hometown. Anne Enright said, and she was the author of Actress that we just heard about, she said, O'Brien is the great, the only survivor of forces that silenced and destroyed who knows how many other Irish women writers. On the 5th of November in 2019, the BBC included The Country Girls, the first novel of the trilogy, on its list of the 100 most influential novels. And John Banville, who I'll talk about in a second, wrote the introduction to a collection of O'Brien's short stories, praising her as, quote, one of the most sophisticated writers now at work, and noting all her characters, quote, are in some way damaged by the world, and specifically by the world of men, end quote. Banville concluded by describing O'Brien as, quote, simply one of the finest writers of our time. And in 2020, she won the £40,000 David Cohen Prize for Lifetime Achievement. And I guess that's an award, I wasn't familiar with it, but they're trying to promote it as something on a par with the Nobel. So O'Brien's novel Girl, like Colum McCann's, this is based on a true story that she has fictionalized. So O'Brien's novel Girl is an amazing accomplishment and a difficult novel to read. It's a fictionalized account of Marian, a young Nigerian girl, kidnapped along with many other girls from their school by a gang of Boko Haram insurgents. The first person narrative describes the long, frightening, and disoriented journey to the Boko Haram camp, the abuse at the camp, the repeated rapes, beatings, physical labor, hunger, and fear. Marian is forcibly married to a gang member, has a baby girl, and 1/3 of the way through the novel experiences the terror, and you would think this would be her a salvation, but she experiences the terror of a government raid on this camp because the government that comes in, they're bent on killing everybody in the camp, not just differentiating the girls from the gang, from the Boko Haram. So she experiences the terror of the government raid and bent on killing everyone in the camp. From there, her nightmare continues. She escapes into the jungle with her baby and another girl. They walk for weeks. They're lost, they're wet, they're foraging for food, and they're still girls themselves. Marian with her baby, they're still girls. Her companion is bit by a snake in the midst of this and dies, leaving Marian alone with her baby. And they both actually are close to death when they are rescued by some women from a remote jungle tribe who nurse Marian and her baby back to health. But they can only offer temporary refuge because the men of this very isolated group had been off hunting. So the women come and rescue Marian and her baby, but knowing the men will be back soon from the hunt, they tell her that she can't stay, that she will have to leave. So from there, Marian, actually the women from this group help point her in the right direction, and they travel to the nearest government military base. And then I'm thinking, okay, things might get better. And they're brought back to the capital where the president and the media of Nigeria make a huge splash and make them these media stars. And clearly this girl is traumatized, and there doesn't seem to be any time for her to offer her the help that she needs to recover. They bring her mother into the midst of this circus, and her mother treats her really in a suspect way. She can't wait to see her mother, but her mother kind of holds her at arm's length too. Miriam thinking that her mother feels somehow Miriam herself was complicit in this. So she does learn that tragedy had befallen her family during her captivity. Her father and her brother have died, and a return to her home village is met with resentment and ostracization. She's shunned by her village and called a bushwife, and her baby is taken from her. And then in the final section of the novel, she leaves home and she searches for her baby and she finds her baby. And that means she cannot come back to her village. And she ends up moving from, they're called IDP camps, internal displacement persons camps in Nigeria. She moves from one camp to another, trying to find some stability. But the novel does end with a glimmer of hope. At the end, she meets some nuns along the way in these IDP camps, and one of the nuns she meets at one of the camps offers her a job as a teacher because Miriam was educated. She was taken from a school. They offer her a job as a teacher and a permanent home for her baby and her, and that is how the novel ends. The Atlantic magazine praises O'Brien, an 88-year-old Irish woman, finding the voice of a barely pubescent Nigerian girl. It's written in the first person. O'Brien traveled to Nigeria in 2016 and 2017 and met with several young women who were among those kidnapped by Boko Haram in April 2014 and had escaped their captivity. Miriam is a blend of all these girls, their imprisonment and torture, their endurance, and ultimately their strength. O'Brien has been shining light on the restrictions women endure since the Country Girls in 1960. And in this novel, Girl, she really distills all those voices into this one horrific story. Do I have time for the last novel?
Oh, you do.
Okay. All right, finally, John Banville. John Banville has lived two separate lives as a writer. His literary life as John Banville and his popular detective fiction life as Benjamin Black. In his literary life, he's been compared to Proust, Nabokov, and Henry James. His novels are dense, stream of consciousness, philosophical ruminations on, as one literary critic said, loss, obsession, destructive love, and the pain that accompanies freedom. Banville was born in 1945 and has published 18 novels as John Banville between 1971 and 2020. He started publishing murder mysteries under the name Benjamin Black in 2006 and has published 13 novels since then as Benjamin Black. These include a series of 6 novels within that grouping about a police pathologist named Quirk. He has no first name, he's just called Quirk. And those are all set in Dublin in the 1950s. And actually Quirk's life parallels Banville's own life in Dublin at the same time. And Quirk lives in the same street, on the same street that Banville himself lived on. All the Benjamin Black novels are plot-driven whodunits that explore the question of evil. Snow, his novel from 2020, seems to be taking the author in a new direction, or perhaps the middle literary road. It's a murder mystery with literary weight, and it's a murder mystery not by Benjamin Black, but by John Banville. So a murder mystery with literary weight by John Banville. The review in the New York Times review speculates a hybrid of sorts will be the next phase of Banville's writing life. The Irish Independent said Snow, the novel, was beautifully written, and a page turner. The plot involves the death of a priest in the Wexford countryside in 1957. The death takes place in a Protestant big house owned by the Osborne family. I won't give you the ending of this one, I promise. The death takes place, in the Protestant big house owned by the Osborne family, and the investigating officer from Dublin is Sigint Stratford, and Sigint is spelled like St. John, Sigint Stratford. He himself is a Protestant. So the officer, Sigint Stratford, a Protestant himself, grew up in another big house in the same county. The murder takes place in the library. It sounds very much like a formulaic murder mystery, the big house in the library. And the patriarch is a retired British military colonel, and every member of the family, a young second wife, 2 grown children, the protective doctor supplying the second wife with laudanum. They all seem to be placed out of central casting. They're stiff, they're kind of artificial. Strafford, and he's always correcting people too, they call him Stafford, and he always says, no, there's an R, and I find myself, it's hard to say that. Strafford takes a room in the town inn where we are also introduced to the Catholic population, the inn pub owners, the young barmaid, the townspeople who work at the big house, and a farmhand with bad teeth. But this is not an Agatha Christie mystery, nor is it an Irish big house novel about the decline of the Protestant Irish, about the decline of the Protestant ascendancy. We quickly see that pieces are out of place, and I think Banville is purposely giving us kind of a stereotypical look at what the big house might be. But we quickly see pieces are out of place. The victim is a priest, stabbed in the carotid artery and then castrated, and you find that out on the second page, so I'm not giving too much away. Stabbed in the carotid artery and then castrated in the big house. This is 1957 Ireland. As one review said, no one would kill a priest. And why would a country priest be drinking whiskey and spending nights with the Protestant ascendancy? With 21st century hindsight, Banville shows us what now we know. That many things were rotten in Catholic Ireland in the 1950s, and the cause of the victim's murder is the result of other things we now know. Strafford learns that there were victims before the victim. With a brief but powerful breach from his fictional domain, Banville includes the very real Archbishop McQuaid, the McQuaid who banned Edna O'Brien's book. Banville includes the very real Archbishop McQuaid in the investigation, and he's in his novel. This is, as I mentioned, the same McQuaid who banned O'Brien's The Country Girls. McQuaid was the very real power in Ireland from 1950 to 1960, directing the government and all Irish institutions with the full authority of the Catholic Church. Taoiseachs and ministers, school principals, and newspaper publishers dared not cross him, including police chiefs. So back to our novel. Within days of the priest's death, the newspapers report the accidental death of Father Thomas Lawless. Police Chief Hackett, who also appears, I guess, in the Benjamin Black novels, Police Chief Hackett tells Strafford, close the case. Archbishop McQuaid summons Strafford to his country residence with indirect but clear marching orders and career-ending threats if the case is not closed. Banville takes the big house subgenre and then turns it on itself. And I won't say too much more about the plot, just in case you read it, and I do recommend it. Banville takes the big house subgenre and he turns it on itself. By the late 50s, the big house and its Protestant ascendancy had already declined. This novel shows us the decline of the other house, the church. And throughout, Banville weaves into the narrative Strafford's own running internal musings on Irish Protestant identity, while the snow is general. And he uses the line from Joyce, the snow is general all over Wexford and threatens to cover everything up. The cop is the consummate outsider in police procedurals. And Banville shows us in the 1950s, the Irish Protestant is also an outsider. And here we have our main character is both Protestant and a policeman. So he is doubly on the outside. So final paragraph. So what can we say about Irish fiction in 2020? We hear the voices of women and girls, and we hear the stories of relationships. We see the fierce bonds between parents and their children. In many, we are transplanted into Irish life with questions of identity. And even in those set beyond the shores of Ireland is an echo of Ireland. Hamlet's mysticism is Irish. Girls' voiceless oppression comes from an author who knows it from the inside of County Clare. And the violent sectarianism of Epiragon is the history of Ireland itself. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I went so long.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you, Meg. We're all still here. That's good. And there's people on Facebook too. So that was great. You know, it's good to get a kind of an overview first of the entire year, you know, and then this 10 that you focused on. So that's great. I'm surprised you'd never, well, I'm not surprised. that you never read Marian Keyes. You know, she was super popular in Ireland in the 90s and the 2000s, and very, very funny. When I was in London doing research for my master's, my mom came with me. You know, I was 20 years of age, and she came with me for a couple of days, and she wasn't allowed into one of the, I don't know, was it the public records office or something? You know, you had to have ID and kind of an academic reason for being there. So she stayed outside and read Marian Keyes in the reception area, God bless her. I think it was Rachel's holiday, and she said she laughed out loud inside the public records office, like in Kew Gardens, and you know, the receptionist kept looking up at her, and you know, and she said, but it was so hilarious.
Well, you know, I knew the name, but just had never read anything by her. But I really enjoyed the novel. Yeah. That was a surprise.
Well, and it's light because you know, it sounds like a lot of these other 9 were kind of, you know, heavier and denser, and so I have read a lot of those authors. I don't think I've read any of those books, but now I've you know, earmarked about 5. So does anyone have any? Well, you didn't like Normal People. I'm kind of not surprised at that. Yeah, and the show is amazing. So maybe don't watch the show with, you know, either your parents or your children, whatever age group you're in. You know, watch it on your own. So who has anyone any questions or comments? I'm checking the chat and the Facebook. We still have a lot of you on.
Or have any of you read any of these novels and have?
Or if you had questions about the other ones, maybe that make mentions. And
or any other comments about what you've read in 2020.
You can unmute yourself if you'd rather not type, although you're shy.
Speak up.
Meg, it was a great presentation, and I always have to pick a book for my book group. Once or twice a year, and I'm listening very closely. So I definitely have a couple that I'd be interested in. It was excellent. It was excellent. It didn't, you know, the time just went. It was like listening to stories. It was enjoyable.
Oh, thank you. Well, really an amazing group of novels.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
And Jean asks, do you have a favorite? She says her friend loved Hamlet and felt it was a terrific novel. It sounds good.
I did. I loved Hamlet. It is. It's really. It's art. You know, the artistry of her writing, but the story is so compelling too.
And it's good to put the wife, at the center for a change. You know, yes, I think I read another one years ago called Shakespeare's Wife. I can't remember who wrote that, but it was kind of trying to put Anne Hathaway, you know, back in the story.
Yeah.
And it's good for Women's History Month, of course, to do that. So
yes, and a lot of these novels, I think, focus on women.
Yeah. Any other?
A favorite one you mentioned. Well, Hamlet certainly is a favorite. I loved Epeirogon. I mean, I really loved that one. I think I need to read it again. There's so many pieces that he is bringing together. And it's just a beautiful story of these two fathers who, amid extraordinary odds, you know, come together, really as soulmates.
Yeah, I liked the allusion to the Scheherazade, you know, story too, and as you said, you know, stories and trying to talk to each other and bridge a divide. We can learn that here in this country too, you know. So it's a lovely way of looking at it. Caroline said she's already on her library list ordering a few of these, so that's good. and she loved it. I mean, that's true. You know, we actually might try and order some of them into the museum store at some point, but you know, the library is a great option. Or if there's local bookstores, you know, where you are, that's good too. I'm just trying to see if anyone else has comments on Facebook.
Yeah.
Anyone else here to want to chime in?
Meg, it's Susan McDermott. I haven't read any of those books, but I loved Edna O'Brien when I was reading her in the 80s. And now it amazes me that at her age of 88 or 89, whatever she is, to write something about the kidnappings, it really inspires me to get her book.
And it's not a very long book either, but incredibly compelling. And she gets, you know, the cadence of this girl is amazing. You know, there's the flow of the ideas. So
that is amazing. I mean, this elderly Irish woman, capturing the mind and experience of a young African woman is just the disparity blows my mind.
Yeah, it really is. It's remarkable.
But as you said, the small town kind of attitude, and so when she goes back to her own tribe and is rejected, things like that did happen in Ireland, with the Magdalen laundries and her own experience as an author, to have her books burned, my God, so it's actually, even though it seems incredibly disparate, the attitude and the experience is probably, very similar, really.
Yes.
Women's experience, universal. Yeah. So people have thanked you. Bob said it was brilliant presentation, and Jean said, loved the way you presented it. Does anyone else have a book that they read that we didn't mention that they thought we all should?
Other recommendations.
Yeah. And I'll just check on Facebook too, because
one thing I'll add too is that the John Banville book I recommend as well. And he really, I think he deals so thoughtfully with this idea of what is the place of the Protestant in Ireland. The big house is gone, the ascendancy is gone. So where do those people, the narrator's a cop, what is his place in a country so dominated by Catholicism? When
that's something that's coming up now as we talk about border polls and Brexit, and how would we subsume? So I think the leader of the DUP was interviewed, yesterday maybe, or the day before, on Irish radio, and basically said, like, we are British, you don't get it, and so this is a guy born and raised in Northern Ireland, and absolutely considers himself British. So it's an interesting conundrum. We had somebody speak, I think it was at the start of this month. Oh no, it was probably Peter Maloney when we did the Brexit talk, and I had never even thought about it, and he said we would probably have to change the Irish flag to allow the 6 counties in, because even though that flag was specifically designed, to encourage the peace between the green and the orange for the Protestants, and it's not the green flag with the harp, which had traditionally been. So it is not actually the rebel flag of Ireland. He said it has become such a hated symbol, to Protestants in the north, and it's often burned in effigy. That's a massive symbol that, has taken on a whole meaning that it was not intended. And so to your point, Meg, I think that's very interesting. How would we grapple with that ourselves, as the 26 counties,
Right. Which is why I think McCann was very sensitive
to that,
the divide, to the conflict.
So I think you've given, I want to read the ghost story one too that the New York Times reviewed that you just mentioned really quickly, and I will extract the slides that had the lists on them for people.
Oh, good.
Because I was writing down the names,
Oh, good.
But I'll put those up on our Facebook page tomorrow. I might do it tonight, but it'll probably be tomorrow.
That's fine. And I apologize for taking so long. And
no, we're delighted.
Appreciate such a kind audience.
Yeah, no, it was great, and you didn't give too many spoilers, which was good.
I know. I think I definitely did with Normal People, and that had so much hype.
That had so much hype. I don't think there's anything that people haven't seen about that one. Yeah,
I know. So, I know, and I felt bad actually criticizing it. I don't know if anybody else read it and wanted to defend it.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I was conflicted, I will say, about the series, and I liked what you said about how her own trauma had been kind of troped into sort of stereotypes rather than, I did read a good few articles that talked about her attitude to her own sexuality and why it was problematic, so, but, the one thing I will say for it, I think that author is my age or probably even maybe younger, which is scary to admit. I liked the fact that it discussed teenagers having sex, and it was a very new sort of departure for Irish novels, even though we've talked about Edna O'Brien and her kind of scandals in the 60s, but this was very modern, and very raw kind of, so from that point it was like a more adult Judy Blume type book, which was so scandalous when I was a teenager in Ireland to read Judy Blume,
Well, did you read her first novel? The one the reviews I read just said that one was better.
Okay, yeah. She was a good writer probably, but the topic,
And she was rushed to get this one done. I think her publisher was rushing her.
Yeah. And can I say, what kind of a genius was Emma Donoghue to come up with a novel about a pandemic before the pandemic hit?
The reason she started writing it, because it was the anniversary of, in 2018, she was looking at the centenary of the 1918 flu.
Yeah.
And so that's what prompted her to write. And my goodness, I think that book has sold like crazy.
Oh yeah, so no, you don't even have to market it, really. Actually, and you mentioned Dr. Kathleen Lynn. I know that Dr. McAuliffe will be talking about her in her talk on Monday.
Oh, good.
So, guys, if nobody has any other questions or comments, I'm delighted that we were able to do this. Very good, Meg. Thank you so much for your thoughtful critique, and it's good actually to read a book that you don't, that you told us how you honestly felt, and so. But I definitely have a top 5 out of that 10 that I want to read.
Good. Well, I loved reading. One last thing I'll say is I wanted to get through the 10, and for the last 3 weeks, I had one going on audio, and then I was reading one in the morning, and I was finishing another one at night because I thought I got to get these done.
I know. Oh, that's hard. I don't usually read one myself at a time, but it can be difficult when you're juggling too many of them.
I just knew I wanted to get them done, but it was a great experience. So thank you for giving me a platform.
Yeah, well, we've done book clubs twice in the past. We must get back into when we can meet in person, or maybe even over the summer I'll kind of send out something in the newsletter that we can set one up, because now we can do Zoom. So even if I prefer meeting in public, but it would be great to do a little book circle chat, so and I am working on something else actually about, it'll be historical topics, but kind of a guided reading seminar thing that I'll lead, but that's further down the track. So there'll be loads of assigned reading from the museum in the coming months. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great night. And I hope, to see you enjoying the books. Let us know if you enjoyed them or if you get to read them. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Lasch Carroll.
Thank you.
Take care. Good night.
Thanks, Craig.
Bye-bye. Thanks all.